There we go. It is a pleasure to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Amy Spitalnick, who is the director of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Amy, actually CEO and a nationally recognized leader on countering anti-Semitism and extremism, protecting democracy. She previously, as many of you probably know, led the successful lawsuit against the Charlottesville neo-Nazis. We're going to have a kind of conversation up here tonight. We'll take a time for a few, but not a whole lot of questions, and then I'll beg Amy to stay for the oneg outside, and you can tug at her ear. She's got a lot of background. Hopefully you read all of that we sent out. She serves on boards of directors of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Tufts University Hillel, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, that's PERIL, at American University, where my brother-in-law works as a fundraiser, as well as Tree of Life's Academic Advisory Council and Bedrock National Leadership Council. I want to tell you a little bit about JCPA. Now, if you can name 14 Jewish organizations by their initials, then you must work for one of them, because that's usually the story here. For more than 80 years, JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, Amy hasn't been there for 80. She's been there for 2 years, has served as the leading voice in the American Jewish community on building broad-based coalitions and strong relations across communities. JCPA mobilizes the Jewish community and works in coalition with national partners representing diverse constituencies in pursuit of a just and democratic society where all communities are safe and free, building understanding that there is no Jewish safety without inclusive democracy and no inclusive democracy without Jewish safety. I've asked Amy to also spend a little time giving us some background on JCPA's work. So Amy, welcome. Shalom Aleichem. Here, have a microphone.
Thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. I live in Carroll Gardens, so I'm a little bit of an interloper coming up from, 2 neighborhoods away, but I used to live in Brooklyn Heights, and so this has always been a place that I would drop into for services before I could afford synagogue membership.
Plymouth Church.
Plymouth Church, or join some of my former bosses in New York politics when they would show up here to speak. And I will particularly note one of my former bosses in New York politics is here, former New York Attorney General Barbara Underwood, who was so formative in so much of my own understanding of how we protect our democracy and our rights in this moment. And so it's particularly lovely to be with you all tonight. So JCPA's work is really at the intersection of the issues that I think we as a Jewish community are thinking about on a moment-by-moment and existential basis right now. It really feels like the threats and the pain and the concerns are coming from all directions. And JCPA's work is really focused on the understanding that, as the rabbi said, we can't have Jewish safety without inclusive democracy, and we can't have inclusive democracy without Jewish safety. And our work for over 81 years has really been about that recognition, both mobilizing Jews to show up because we know that our safety depends on defending the democratic norms and institutions, securing and advancing the civil rights that have been so important to our own security and so many other communities, and advancing a more just America, whether it is mobilizing Jews to show up at the March on Washington, whether it is co-founding the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is the preeminent national civil rights coalition on whose board I'm proud to sit now, whether it's mobilizing for Soviet Jewry or for support for Israel during the Intifadas or whatever it might be. And in this moment, particularly right now, when we're seeing both existential rises in anti-Semitism across the political spectrum and dire threats to our democracy, mobilizing our community to show up, just as we work in close partnership across diverse communities in the civil rights, democracy, labor, and other spaces, to make clear that there is no such thing as a truly multiracial, multi-faith, inclusive America unless all Jews and the diversity of our community is also safe and free here in the United States. So I can talk a lot more about what anti-Semitism looks like in this moment, but perhaps I'll let you prompt me in the direction.
Okay, so, and your people were great. They sent me about 400 questions I could ask you, and of course, I ignored some of them.
Please.
So I want to ask you, before you start speaking about your work with JCPA, I think we'd all be interested in hearing a bit about your experience in the successful lawsuit exposing and weakening the dangerous white nationalist thugs who chanted "Jews will not replace us" during Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017. I actually saw the Billy Joel video, about his story, and of course he has that moment where he has a yellow star that he's wearing at the concert to remind people of his Jewish heritage, both on front and on back. And that concert was, in fact, right after that event, which it feels sometimes like a lifetime ago because it was before COVID. But at the same time, it was only 2017. So maybe a little bit of your story and your connection.
Yeah. So I think many of us remember these images of Nazis with torches marching on the University of Virginia, chanting "Jews will not replace us." For me, I was working in the New York Attorney General's office at the time, and I remember watching this and thinking, what do they even mean, right? What does "Jews will not replace us" even mean? I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I remember I grew up at a time in America where it was a pretty good time to be a Jew in America. It wasn't perfect, and this idea that it was a golden age and anti-Semitism didn't exist, I don't fully buy into. But I do think it was a time, growing up in New York as a Jew whose grandparents had survived the unthinkable, I felt very lucky. And watching those images, like many of you, I felt like for the first time that safety had been ripped away, at least for me. And I think in the 8 years since, what's become clear is that the hate and the violence that we saw on display that weekend wasn't an isolated incident, but really a harbinger of increasingly normalized bigotry, hate, and extremism that has really been mainstreamed in a variety of ways. What happened in Charlottesville was not just an isolated incident, but a harbinger, as I said, but also not an accident. As the lawsuit that our organization brought exposed, it was violence that was planned meticulously in advance, down to conversations on social media about whether they could hit protesters with cars and claim self-defense, which is, of course, precisely what happened. First, the violence with the torches on that Friday night, where a number of UVA students and community members were surrounded and beaten, including a number of our plaintiffs, and then the violence throughout the day during the actual Unite the Right march, in which a number of people were attacked, culminating in a car attack on a crowd of peaceful protesters, in which Heather Heyer was murdered, and many others, including many of our plaintiffs, were grievously injured in significant physical and emotional ways, as you could imagine. And so that wasn't an accident, and what happened in Charlottesville wasn't an isolated incident, and we've seen this cycle of violence and extremism expand over the last 8 years. Pittsburgh, the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history in 2018. Poway, California, where Chabad was attacked, someone motivated by these same conspiracy theories. El Paso, Texas, where the Latino community was targeted. Buffalo, where the Black community was targeted. Christchurch, New England, where the Muslim community was targeted. This tells us over and over again that these anti-Semitic, xenophobic, racist conspiracy theories, rooted in these ideas of Jewish control and power seeking to change our demographics or the white race, don't just target Jews, but make all communities less safe. And now in this moment, the political moment we're in, we're seeing not just the violence targeting Jews and so many others, but these same conspiracy theories underpinning a lot of dehumanizing draconian policies aimed at immigrants, our voting rights, and so much more at a time when our democracy is under dire threat. And so it's important to understand that what's happening in this moment now, record level anti-Semitism and hate crimes targeting so many communities, the fact that it feels like this extremism is really coming from all directions didn't come out of nowhere, but has really been, was really previewed over the last decade. And I will say, I think of Charlottesville as really the moment that ripped the Band-Aid off, but I was talking with someone a few weeks ago, and for me, the first moment when I knew something was wrong was actually right here in Brooklyn Heights, when there was a swastika at Adam Yauch Park, if you remember. In fall of 2016, November of 2016, I'd been working in the New York AG's office and remember getting the call about that and worked with colleagues and former bosses of mine who represented the area to organize that rally at the park. I think it was on a Sunday in mid-November. And for me, that was the first moment where I felt like something was wrong. But Charlottesville, I think, as I said, really ripped that Band-Aid off. And as we've now seen, it really feels like the threats are coming from all directions. And I'll note that, we were very proud to hold these 24 extremists accountable in court. We brought a lawsuit on behalf of 9 plaintiffs with an incredible legal team, and I went to trial in fall of 2021, and ultimately after a 4-week trial won judgments to the tune of $26 million that have effectively bankrupted and dismantled many of these hate groups and leaders and become a model for how we hold extremists accountable. But there was a story in the Times a few weeks ago that I will say we were a part of, that makes clear that those ideas on display in Charlottesville and that the violence that we sought to hold accountable in court have now become so pervasive and normalized in our politics that we have to be clear-eyed about. And accountability matters, but we also need to be building the democratic resiliency that we need to prevent this hate and extremism from becoming normalized in the first place. And I think for many of us who work in progressive spaces or democratic spaces, we understand it now when it's this white supremacist conspiracy theory of Jews will not replace us. In a post-October 7th world, it's also so important to be clear-eyed about how these conspiracy theories are manifesting on the far left of our political spectrum, with the same tropes and lies about Jewish control or Zionist control and power being Jews in Jewish institutions and synagogues, target students on campus and marginalize and remove them from the very spaces in which they need to live and study. And ultimately, as we've seen over the last 6 months in particular with the firebombing of Governor Josh Shapiro's home on Passover, the Capitol Jewish Museum shooting, and the Boulder attack, becoming increasingly violent as well, targeting Jews here under the guise of protesting Israeli policy. And so we need to be clear-eyed about this unique way that anti-Semitism operates, as this conspiracy theory that seeks to ultimately not just pit Jews against other communities, but sow distrust in our democracy and institutions that creates this feedback loop that we're stuck in which anti-Semitic conspiracies are used to make Jews and so many other communities less safe and fundamentally undermine the fabric of our democracy. And so too, as our democracy is now being undermined in so many ways, it creates the conditions for these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to further flourish. And we're stuck in this loop. And our job is to break out of it if we're ever going to both be safe as a Jewish community and protect the rights and safety of all in our democracy.
So I'm going to ask you a follow-up to that, which is put you on the spot a little bit. Our president back then, of course, said there were fine people on both sides. And our courts have shifted since that time. So I wonder, if I were to ask you, do you think you would have the same success moving through the court system today under the current administration that you had in 2021?
It's a hard question to ask. I think, there's someone else in this room who could probably answer this question better than me. And I feel funny answering this in front of my former boss, who's spearheading a number of the actual cases holding the federal government accountable right now and other extremists to account. But I think I still have hope and optimism that our justice system works. I think if you look at what happened in our Charlottesville case, we went to trial in the Western District of Virginia, which, while the courthouse itself is in Charlottesville, the district is really the entire western side of the state. And this is not a place that I think, it doesn't look a lot like Brooklyn. Politically, it is a very conservative place. And I remember driving in for trial. I'd been in Charlottesville many times, but had largely flown or took the train in. And driving in, I remember passing by Confederate flag after Confederate flag. And for the first time, feeling really anxious about what the verdict might be at trial as I was preparing to go and work with our plaintiffs and our legal team to get things off the ground. And the fact that this jury, which was not a jury of progressives or Democrats, and had spent 4 weeks in which the defendants and their lawyers very explicitly made clear their goal was to desensitize the jury and the broader public to hate and extremism. And they made Holocaust jokes, racist jokes, and other bigotry and extremism sort of fully on display in the courtroom every single day. The fact that they failed in desensitizing the jury to hate, even in a district like this one, which is not known for its progressive or liberal values, gives me hope that there are people who still want to see accountability and justice and still know right from wrong in this country, even if the most extreme voices have been given an outsized microphone and seen their voices and their conspiracy theories and hate so normalized.
Thank you. Can you tell us which non-Jewish communities and organizations JCPA has historically partnered with? And I'm interested, has there been a change in the makeup of that coalition that we've been a part of? What sort of changes?
Yeah, well, I started my job a month before October 7th. And this is a job in which my main role is to work in coalitions to advance Jewish safety and democracy and to in turn mobilize the Jewish community as well. And so as you can imagine, within a month of starting this job, that entire worldview was thrown into question. I think many of us in the Jewish community were told very quickly by extreme voices on both sides that we're entirely alone, that no one is going to show up for us, and that the pain and fear we were feeling in the aftermath of October 7th wasn't real, and that we were entirely alone. Frankly, from both extremes, I heard this. And my experience was much more complicated. I think about the Black civil rights leaders and interfaith partners, some of whom I had worked with for years through the Charlottesville work or in government here in New York, elsewhere, who picked up the phone to me on October 8th and said, I don't know if you have family or friends in Israel, I don't know what your relationship is, but I imagine today is really hard for you, and just know I'm here. I think about the folks who are willing to create space for us to bring Muslim and Arab and Jewish American leaders together to figure out how we hold our civil rights and anti-hate coalitions together at a time when we saw spiking anti-Semitism and spiking anti-Arab and anti-Muslim hate in October and November of 2023. And I think about the folks in the labor and pro-democracy spaces with whom we work who are really navigating untenable and increasingly, frankly, insane situations in some of their schools and campuses, and decided to lean into the work with partners like us to figure out a different path forward. And so whether it's the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which I mentioned before, that JCPA co-founded with the NAACP in 1950, Maya Wiley, who I'm sure many of you recall from our last mayoral election, a former colleague of mine at City Hall in New York, is now the president of the Leadership Conference. And the work that we've done with them has been among the most meaningful, both behind the scenes, keeping our coalition together to fight for civil rights and protect all communities in this moment, and particularly after the Boulder and Capitol Jewish Museum attacks, JCPA and the Leadership Conference partnered on a statement from 65 civil rights groups making unequivocally clear that when Jews are targeted for the actions of the Israeli government, that's anti-Semitism, period, full stop, and is unacceptable. And for that sort of coalition, including Muslim and Arab groups, to make a statement like that felt so deeply meaningful and important in this moment. Just as right now we are doing extensive work with, for example, our national partnership with the American Federation of Teachers and our work with the National Education Association, places where these issues have really been so fraught, to try to advance a different path forward, to show that we could bring constructive nuance and dialogue to these spaces, that we can understand how to fight anti-Semitism, and that it doesn't take away from commitments to Palestinian human rights and dignity and the human rights and dignity of all people, and create a more constructive and collaborative path forward than the false binaries and false choices that have so often characterized these conversations. And so I've found many reasons for optimism and even some hope in a moment where I think we're repeatedly told that we're alone. For me, how we do that best is to help our partners and allies reject the false choices that exist on either end of the political spectrum. On the far right, those who are telling us that we can't protect Jewish safety without undermining the core democratic norms and values and civil rights and liberties that have been so inherent to our advancement and safety in this country. Instead, that we must somehow gut billions of dollars in research and other funds at universities, or deport people with due process, or revoke the charter of labor unions in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. And that's a false choice. Just as there's a false choice on the other end of the political spectrum telling us that we can't be proudly Jewish or be committed to Israel's security and the safety of the Israeli people without also caring about the humanity and dignity of the Palestinian people and the situation in Gaza. And so where we've found the most hope and the most constructive relationships have been with partners who are willing to reject those false choices on either extremes and instead find a more collaborative and constructive path in the middle.
For people in the congregation who want to maybe support, or we have some members of different communities here tonight as well, would you make a recommendation of one or two really great partners?
I mean, the Leadership Conference, I will say, and I say this not just because I'm a board member there, but it's been a place where I've found true hope and I think real progress in a number of different ways. And then we work very closely with Interfaith America and Interfaith Alliance, which I think have both been doing extraordinary work on campuses, in interfaith communities, to again hold these spaces together at a time when it feels like it's really hard to do that. And to have the partners that we have at those organizations has been so meaningful.
Thank you. Hate-based extremism obviously includes, and you alluded to this, more than anti-Semitism. What are you seeing from your vantage point at JCPA when it comes to other forms of organized hate in our country?
So in so many ways, it's impossible to separate anti-Semitism from other forms of hate. I think the goal of extremists is to make us think that the only way to tackle anti-Semitism is to tackle anti-Semitism alone, or to tackle racism alone, or to effectively break us out into silos so that we're not actually understanding the holistic, interconnected way in which hate operates. But, Jews will not replace us was about Jews, and it was about narrow worldview for what this country should be, just as those who are exploiting the situation in Israel and Gaza to target Jews here do so in a way intended to ultimately divide Jews from the very pro-democracy, pro-civil rights, anti-hate coalitions we need. And so understanding this inherent interconnection in hate is existential to the fight against it. And so what we're seeing now at a moment of rising political violence, and you just need to look at the FBI hate crime statistics, or frankly the news from the last few weeks, to understand that none of us are imagining this. We know anti-Semitism is rising and that it is the largest proportion of the religious-based hate crimes that we're seeing in this country, but hate crimes targeting the Black community, the LGBTQ community, and I will say the trans community in particular, that has been on the front lines of so much of this dehumanization. Immigrants and refugees, Muslims and Arab Americans post-October 7th, but long before that, and so much more. This is all inherently interconnected. And so while there are specific things we need to do to fight anti-Semitism because of how it uniquely operates as this conspiracy theory, ultimately the way that we fight anti-Semitism is by fighting the broader hate and extremism that's become so normalized and pervasive, and that's by building democratic resiliency. It's by investing in our democratic infrastructure, not just our voting rights and our civil rights that are under attack right now, but teaching media and digital literacy so that we are all, not just our kids, but all of us, smarter consumers of social media where so much of this is being normalized. Investing in hate crimes prevention and Title VI in the Office of Civil Rights, which protects Jewish and all students on college and K-12 campuses. Investing in nonprofit security grants for all houses of worship and not politicizing them by basically telling synagogues and others that they need to, allow ICE in or agree to ban illegal DEIA if they're going to accept security funding from the federal government, which is what the Department of Homeland Security is trying to do right now. And so the way that we fight anti-Semitism is to invest in this broader democratic resiliency and to protect the rights and safety of all communities, just as by fighting anti-Semitism, we inherently protect the rights and safety of all communities and protect our democracy. And so many of these policies ultimately protect all of us at a time when we're effectively being pitted against one another by extreme voices and told there's not enough pie to go around for all of us, when we know there's actually more than enough, and these policies are existential to all of our safety.
So I want to ask a question that I'm not sure everyone will agree with, but many of us feel there are problematically conflicting truths at work in our nation. That violent anti-Semitism is on the rise, that's factual, and that anti-Semitism is being used as a political tool to go after colleges and other institutions that have seemingly or actually ignored anti-Semitism while focusing on other hatreds, meaning campuses especially have been focused on other groups and making sure they're protected. How can we as Jews demand equal treatment at campuses and institutions while not being used as a monkey's paw? So if you don't know that term, that's the magic monkey's paw that you get your wish, but it has terribly unforeseen consequences.
Yeah. Look, again, we're being offered a false choice right now. That if we want to protect Jewish safety and Jewish students on campus or the Jewish community writ large, we have to give up on the democratic norms and institutions that have been so inherent to our own safety and advancement in this country. I think about my own family. My grandparents survived the Holocaust. They came here. They were a seamstress and a taxi driver. They joined unions. My parents were New York City public school teachers who were also union members and who really relied on the opportunity this country provided them, the community colleges and other institutions, to create a life that led to me having the life I had. And now I have a 3-year-old who I'm raising in Brooklyn who is I hope we'll have even more opportunity than I had. And for the first time, I think my family and I talk often about how, will she? We don't know at this moment, because we're watching how the very institutions that have been so important to our own family and so many others are coming under attack. And so we're offered this false choice. Two things are true at the same time. And if you look at the poll data of the Jewish community and more broadly, we are all able to hold multiple truths at the same time. We all know in our bones and the reality of the world telling us that anti-Semitism is real and rising, and it exists across the political spectrum, and we shouldn't be gaslit into believing that it isn't happening. It is real. And we are seeing this administration and others exploit those real fears to gut our universities, to gut the research funding on Alzheimer's and cancer and so much more that are truly existential to our safety and our futures. We're seeing it used to deport people without due process. At my own alma mater, Tufts, where a student wrote an op-ed in the newspaper and was snatched by masked ICE agents off the street and held for weeks and weeks and weeks, ultimately released thanks to our justice system. But again, a testament to just how fragile these norms and these values are right now. We're seeing Republicans in Congress go after the charter of a national teachers union under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism. None of this makes Jews safer. It actually makes us less safe because of how inherently our safety is tied to our democracy and how it effectively uses us as the smokescreen to go after a broader extremist agenda. And so we can do both things at the same time. We can hold our universities accountable to protecting Jewish and all students, making sure they're enforcing codes of conduct and time, place, and manner restrictions, and that they're adhering to their Title VI obligations. And we can do so in a way that doesn't undermine that we know are so inherent to our community and to so many others. And our job is over and over again to reject this false choice, because we're just going to keep seeing it play out in so many other ways, whether it's through the universities or the labor unions or immigration or so much more, in which the Jewish community is being used as effectively a weapon and a smokescreen to advance a broader extremist agenda, and none of that serves us.
Thank you. So the current administration has positioned anti-Semitism as a major cause in going after funding at certain universities, yet simultaneously we have appointees and friends of this administration who seem to be publicly pro-Nazi. I'm going to give you examples of those people. Nick Fuentes, the far-right commentator who marched in Charlottesville, right? Friend of the president. Paul Ingracia, the White House liaison to the Department of Homeland Security. E.J. Antoni, the President Trump's nominee as of last month to be Commissioner of Labor Statistics following the dismissal of Erica McIntarfer, from that post. Antoni, if you've seen the picture, E.J. Antoni has frequently used a painting of the German warship, the Bismarck, as a background when conducting interviews. He once described the Nazi-era battleship, which was sunk by Allied forces in 1941, as hard not to love. So, what does it say if the organized Jewish community can't even prevent these out-and-out haters from participating or being appointed to government posts?
Yeah. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that just barely scratches the surface of some of these appointees. We've worked with NPR over the last 9 months on a series of stories on some of these other appointees, some of whom are Senate confirmed positions, many of which are not. And so if you look at the DOD, Department of Defense, or we're now supposed to call it, I think, the Department of War.
Yeah.
I'm going to still call it DOD. The DOD spokesperson is someone who has trafficked extensively in neo-Nazi conspiracy theories, including sort of the Leo Frank conspiracy theories. If you've seen Parade, this is like a deep cut on the neo-Nazi internet. So if you're engaging in that sort of conspiracy theory, you are deep down the rabbit hole of neo-Nazism. Other folks, including people who are leading actual counter-extremism efforts in our federal government, have deep neo-Nazi and white supremacist ties. And it is barely getting the attention at a time when the federal government is, making anti-Semitism supposedly this priority. So if this administration cared about protecting Jewish safety, it first and foremost wouldn't elevate anti-Semitic extremists to positions of power where they are not just responsible for labor statistics, but actually for counter-extremism and domestic terror in this country. But also, they wouldn't be gutting our hate crimes prevention grants, our Title VI and Office of Civil Rights. It wouldn't be weaponizing and politicizing the nonprofit security grants that I imagine this and so many other synagogues around the country rely on. And instead, we're seeing, again, the exploitation of our real fears to advance a political agenda that does nothing to keep us safe. And we can be clear-eyed about the very real threats of anti-Semitism across the political spectrum, including on the far left, without allowing it to be exploited to undermine our safety and so many other communities' rights in our democracy.
So I'm going to go back a little bit deeper into this question and ask, why is my anecdotal experience and reaction that the organized Jewish community has thrown up its hands and isn't actually holding up the mirror to these behaviors on a daily basis in a public way, given the resources financially that we have? We could be taking out full-page advertisements in newspapers across the country pointing out the despicable behavior and comments of these appointees, but we've chosen not to.
So I can't speak to why my counterparts don't do that, frankly. It is a challenging moment in the organized Jewish community where I think some organizations have chosen to sort of fall into a more particularist understanding of anti-Semitism and decide that they were going to really lean into a more narrow view of what it takes to keep Jews safe in this country. Why this doesn't fit into that narrow view, I don't know. That being said, there are definitely a number of our partners in the organized Jewish community, including we're organizing a communal statement right now around one of the folks that you mentioned who's up for confirmation. And we've seen some of our colleagues certainly step up. And what all I can do is speak to what we at JCPA are doing, which is that we are going to keep ringing the alarm bell, whether it's about these specific nominees and appointees, whether it's about the exploitation of anti-Semitism to undermine our democracy, or whether it's about the real anti-Semitism that exists across the political spectrum, and we all to call out. And so we're going to keep doing that. We're a small and scrappy team of about 9 people right now, although we're hiring for a number of roles, if you know folks. And we're going to keep doing that, and we're going to keep trying to bring as many of our national and local Jewish partners along as possible. If you're a member of some of these organizations, it's always good for them to hear about your concerns too. And all we can do is keep doing what we think is right in this moment and building the infrastructure to do that. So that's what we're doing at JCPA, and certainly if folks are interested in getting involved with that, you can do so, jewishpublicaffairs.org, or just find me at the ONEG afterwards, because we, as I said, are small and scrappy and trying to punch above our weight at a moment when there's so much work to do, but we really need to be building an ecosystem of organizations and leaders that are unequivocal in calling this out wherever it exists.
So I try really hard to stick to the time frame. I tell people you can come late, you can leave early, and I'm sensitive, but I promised I would give at least, so I'm going to take 2 questions, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity over food and beverage, but members of the, and I'm going to prioritize members of the congregation who might have a question. Bob, I saw a hand go up. No, oh, you have dinner waiting. Okay. Anyone, Barbara? Okay. Jessica.
Thank you so much.
And please introduce yourself.
Oh, yes, I'm Jessica Brown, longtime member. Thank you so much, Amy. I want to say I'm going to nominate you to be the #1 spokesperson when the media needs a comment about anti-Semitism. I don't know how we do that. Any PR people here who can? Anyway, more seriously, I mean, I know so many of us care about Israel and care about democracy in Israel and democracy here, and it's just so frustrating that some of these right-wing anti-Semites seem to think that being pro-Israel is like a get-out-of-jail-free card. And it seems like too many people in the Jewish community kind of let them get away with that. And I don't know if that's a question, but how can we try to counter that?
Look, I think you are right that there are those who are using purported commitment to Israel or to the Jewish community as a smokescreen to advance an agenda that does nothing to keep Jews safe, whether it's the policies we've been talking about, whether it's sort of broader white Christian nationalism or Christian Zionism that ultimately is rooted in a theology that has nothing to do with Jews returning to Israel for a Jewish homeland, but for Jews returning to Israel so that the rapture can happen and all sorts of other things that they believe can come true, right? So I think we all need to be clear-eyed about where our lines are in terms of our tents on both the left and the right? People who engage in actual harmful anti-Semitism, whether it is great replacement theory and invasion rhetoric, which so many of the folks you're describing have normalized, or those who engage in the particularly sharp post-October 7th anti-Semitism under the guise of protesting Israel. We have to be clear about who our partners and allies are. And I think it also means that we need to build the muscle to help people understand how they come to this constructive middle. So I'll share one quick anecdote. I will say some of the folks on the right, probably I'm not the best messenger there, given my work in Democratic officials' offices or on Charlottesville, where folks do engage with us has been on the left side of the political spectrum in particular. And so last summer, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez invited me to do a webinar for her social media followers on anti-Semitism. And you would have thought that both of us were criminals for agreeing to sit down together and talk about these issues. I was, called a self-hating Jew from the far right of our community, and she was ultimately not just criticized for quote-unquote platforming a Zionist, but unendorsed by the Democratic Socialists, where they cited this webinar. You can watch this online. It's 35 minutes. It's not very long. And we talked about a variety of things, including what Zionism actually means to most Jews, as opposed to the way it's become a pejorative in the public conversation. We talked about anti-Semitism on the right and on the left and all of its forms. And to her credit, she said a number of important things during that webinar calling out anti-Semitism, and particularly the next day, when I'm sure many of us remember, there was this horrific anti-Semitic protest outside the Nova Memorial down by Wall Street, and she put out a statement unequivocally naming it as anti-Semitism. She and I have disagreed on a variety of policy fronts since then, but we stayed at the table together. And I think all of us in the spaces where we have credibility, whether it's on the left or the right, or in our workplaces, or in our community centers, or in our schools, or wherever it is, need to figure out how we build the muscle to stay at the table with people who are willing to engage in good faith, because that is how you actually move the needle right now. We're not gonna solve anti-Semitism, and we're not gonna protect our democracy by only talking to people who already agree with us. We need to figure out how to stay at the table and have these constructive conversations with those with whom we have disagreements, wherever we have those relationships and credibility. And so as much as we're gonna keep doing that in the spaces we're doing it with progressive elected officials, civil rights spaces, labor, and others, we need those on the right of our politics to do the same with those who are normalizing some of these ideas under the guise of supporting Israel or protecting American or Israeli security.
Is there a last question? Thank you, Cantor.
Hi, I'm Ryan Geffman-Gold. I think it's great that partner organizations call to express their support on October 8th. What happens then? So how does their sentiment of support trickle down to the everyday people that they represent? I'm curious about how that would happen around the time of October 7th, and also, just kind of piggybacking on the rabbi's question, like, what about today?
What about today? Yeah, so I think it's twofold. I think we need to be doing two things at the same time. And I think our work with these organizations gives me a little bit of hope on both. I think first and foremost, on the grass tops level, right, on the organization to organization level, we need to be building broad coalitions for the policies that keep us all safe. And so many of the organizations and leaders who called me on October 8th, or with whom we've been working in the immediate aftermath, are the same people with whom we're now mobilizing together to protect the nonprofit security grant program and advance and expand that funding, to expand hate crimes prevention funding, to call out anti-Semitism wherever it exists in our government or in our society, and have used that grass tops or sort of bully pulpit position to do more and to do better that keeps Jews safe and so many others safe. And it's also, how do you get that to trickle down to the grassroots, as you're describing? And the work there is harder, right? It's easier for a leader to say the right thing. It's harder to move entire communities at a time when so many are on social media and watching the news, and understandably polarized. And we've been working closely with interfaith clergy and partners and others on programming and sermons and talking points and resources, so that they can also bring this message to their communities, to their mosques and churches, to the local chapters of the national civil rights groups, the teacher union, local and state affiliates that are part of the national unions with whom we have formal partnerships, through the workshops and trainings that we're doing, through actual conversations, modeling what it means to have a hard conversation. I think about my friend Maya Berry, who runs the Arab American Institute, someone with whom I certainly don't agree on everything related to Israel and Gaza, but we have been doing a number of programs in communities around the country geared towards leaders in the interfaith and cross-community space on how we can actually come together across differences in a way that protects and advances the humanity of both Jewish people and Arab and Muslim American people in this moment. And so we need to both be doing the grass tops, bully pulpit advocacy work, and we need to be figuring out the tools we have to bring it down to the grassroots through credible messengers like faith leaders, local civil rights leaders, educators, local labor leaders, and others. And so that's where our work is. I think we need a whole ecosystem of folks who are doing this in their own ways, but that's where we see the opportunity right now.
So a last question. I'm going to ask you for a brief answer.
Very brief.
What gives you hope right now with the new year approaching?
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned it, right? I talked about the AOC webinar. I talked about some of the work we've been able to do in the aftermath of October 7th. I'm finding hope there, that there are people who, despite the real pain and grief of this moment and the understandable polarization that exists, not just in Israel and Gaza, but in our politics more broadly, are willing to sit down across lines of difference and have a conversation that recognizes that the humanity and safety of the Jewish people is important to the rights and safety of all communities in our democracy. And so whether they are elected officials, whether they are organizations that we work with, or others, I'm finding hope in those conversations. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, and it doesn't mean that everything is moving at the pace and speed that we want at a time when we rightfully are seeing threats from so many directions. But if we're not doing that, I don't know what else we're doing. This is the only choice we have. We can either sort of go into our corners and put up our walls and hope that we'll solve anti-Semitism on our own, or we can keep leaning into these challenging conversations and spaces and expand the coalitions we need to actually protect ourselves and our democracy at this existential moment.
Terrific. We could clap, but I'm going to teach you 2 ways that in synagogue we tell people we are so happy that you were here. We have 2 phrases. One is Yesher Kochech, so I'm going to invite you to join with me in a big Yesher Kochech, and the other is Kol HaKavod, all the honor. Kol HaKavod, for the work you're doing, may you be strengthened and move from strength to strength, and please stay with us, and we'll have a l'chaim outside right after the service. And now you can clap. Thank you, Amy.